Greetings and welcome to the 7th video in this module on emotion regulation. Let's continue our garden analogy. In a real garden, we need to plant the right seeds, do some weeding, make sure we have the correct soil, and have a plan for pest control. In a real garden, however, we may get sick of doing all of this maintenance and decide to give up on the garden, maybe even deliberately neglect or destroy it. That's when we need to do the opposite of that urge and take care of the garden anyway. The same concept applies to our garden of emotions. So let's keep gardening. Okay, so every emotion has an urge associated with it. In fact, you can think of emotions as energy in motion. Sometimes these urges are effective and sometimes they're not. So what makes the difference? Well, ineffective urges, if you act on them, make the emotion even more intense and also make the problem at hand even worse. So that's how you know if the urge is not effective. Effective urges, on the other hand, will stabilize the emotion as well as resolve or at the very least de-escalate the issue at hand. So one of the most effective ways of managing problem urges is to act opposite. In other words, do the opposite action of whatever you feel like doing. So of course, acting opposite never feels natural. That's why it's an act. That's why we call it acting opposite. In other words, fake it till you make it. There are many ways to act opposite. We can do this with our words, our behaviors, imagery, posture, or even temperature. So for example, we could say the exact opposite of what we feel like saying. Or we could do the opposite behavior of what we feel like doing. Or sometimes we can simply visualize what the opposite would look like. Sometimes just doing some basic imagery will help neutralize an ineffective problem urge. Or sometimes we can act opposite with our body posture. So for example, if you feel like clenching your hands, maybe just relax them and even open them up. We can even act opposite with our body temperature. If you notice your body temperature spiking, maybe do something to physically cool you down. Okay, so to act on a problem urge, even if you know it's going to make things even worse, is an example of what we call willfulness or stupid stubbornness. Whenever you do whatever you want to do, even if it's only going to make things worse, that's willfulness. That's stupid stubbornness. On the other hand, to do the exact opposite of your urge, even though that's the last thing you want to do in the moment, well, that's an example of willingness or smart stubbornness. So remember, willingness is doing whatever it takes to get the job done, whether you like it or not. So when we demonstrate willfulness and follow our destructive urges, we are not making balanced mind decisions. However, when we demonstrate willingness and act opposite to destructive urges, we are now making wiser decisions from the balanced mind. The more we act opposite to destructive urges, the more we establish habits and patterns which will lead to a healthier, more stable emotionality. How do we actually help a client act opposite? Well, let's use depression as an example. So let's assume you have a client that comes in with the presenting problem of feeling depressed. That's the emotion. What are the problem urges that might go along with depression? Well, the more the client feels depressed, the more they will isolate and withdraw, or procrastinate, or self-harm, or overeat, or oversleep, or maybe even think about death. Right? Those are all very common urges associated with depression. So the first thing you want to help a client understand is the more they feel depressed, the more they feel those urges. Well, that's pretty obvious. But the flip side is also just as true. The more they act on those urges, the more they will feel depressed, right? The more they isolate and withdraw, the more they procrastinate, the more they self-harm, the more they overeat, the more they oversleep, the more they think about death. Those are all urges which will intensify, exacerbate. In other words, make that original emotion, in this case depression, even more intense, even more overwhelming, even more difficult to deal with. And it's important you explain it to a client so that they understand why precisely they need to act opposite. So what would acting opposite be for each of these urges? Well, the opposite of isolating or withdrawing would be to socialize. So of course, with a real client, you're not going to leave the acting opposite that general. You will make it much more specific. In other words, for each of these acting opposite behaviors that you come up with, you will actually create a specific plan. So in other words, who will you socialize with? When are you going to make contact with this person? What are you going to do if that person is not available? Who else might you contact? Right? You really need that level of specificity. You're not going to simply tell a client, oh, when you feel like isolating, just socialize. Make it specific. Well, what's the opposite of procrastinating? Well, you don't want to say, well, just don't procrastinate, right? The opposite should never be just the absence of the urge. It needs to be a specific replacement behavior. So the opposite of procrastinating might be prioritize. And once again, you're going to help the client do that. You're not going to just tell a client, oh, I think you need to do a better job of prioritizing. No, you will actually walk them through that process. What's the opposite of self-harm? Well, the opposite of self-harm would be, of course, self-care. Once again, you're not going to tell the client, well, just stop the self-harm. No, it needs to be a replacement behavior, self-care. But once again, you're not going to leave it that general. You will help the client identify very specific strategies for self-care. And in fact, that's precisely why it's really important to have a coping card in place before you help a client with an acting opposite plan. Because if you remember, the coping card already has things that the client has agreed that they are willing to do and that they want to do. And these are things that work for them. So you want as many of the items from their coping card to be included as acting opposite strategies. So what would be the opposite of overeating? Well, it's not going to necessarily be undereating, right? So the acting opposite behavior is not necessarily literally the opposite, because if overeating is problematic, well, so is undereating, right? So the opposite in this case of overeating might be, well, establishing some kind of meal schedule. So do you see how that's actually the opposite of both extremes of overeating and undereating? So that's the whole point. You want to get the client out of this stupid cycle that we talked about, in which we're simply acting on our urge because of willfulness, in which case we make things even worse. So what would be the opposite of oversleeping? Once again, not necessarily undersleeping, but rather helping the client establish some kind of sleep schedule. And so what would be the opposite of thinking about death? Well, how about planning for the future? So I just want to reiterate some of those points we just made about acting opposite. So remember, intense emotions cause problem urges. However, problem urges also cause intense emotions. So that's why the only way out of the cycle is to act opposite to those urges. But remember, acting opposite is not always literally the opposite. Acting opposite refers to any replacement behavior that will de-escalate the intense emotion. And acting opposite cannot simply be the absence of the problem urge. It must involve an actual replacement behavior. And the replacement behavior must be something specific, not just a general principle. If you think about it, this acting opposite plan becomes a new way of doing life. So for example, socializing instead of withdrawing, prioritizing instead of procrastinating, self-care instead of self-harm, following some kind of schedule for meals and sleep as opposed to just winging it, and also fostering some kind of future orientation, planning for the future instead of thinking about your death. Do you see how if you help a client develop those habits and those patterns, of course they will eventually pull out of their depression, but it's not going to happen overnight either. But do you also see how each of these behaviors is basically laying the foundation for a different way of doing life? In other words, a completely new lifestyle that will support healthier emotions, as opposed to isolating, withdrawing, procrastinating, self-harm, overeating, oversleeping, and thinking about your own death, which will not stabilize your emotions, will not regulate your emotions. In fact, that will cause even more depression. So let's summarize a few of the key points that we covered in this video. Point number 1. Every emotion has an urge associated with it. In fact, you can think of emotions as energy in motion. Sometimes those urges are effective and sometimes they are not. Ineffective urges, once acted upon, make the emotion even more intense and also make the problem at hand even worse. Effective urges, on the other hand, will stabilize the emotion as well as resolve or at least de-escalate the issue at hand. Point number 2. Intense emotions cause problem urges. However, problem urges also cause intense emotions. That's why the only way out of this cycle is to act opposite to the urges, to do the opposite action of whatever you feel like doing. Acting opposite never feels natural. That's why it's an act. Fake it till you make it, as the saying goes. And there are many ways to act opposite. We can do this with words, behaviors, imagery, posture, even temperature. Point number 3. Acting opposite is not always literally the opposite. Acting opposite refers to any replacement behavior that will de-escalate the intense emotion. Acting opposite cannot simply be the absence of the problem urge. It must involve an actual replacement behavior. The replacement behavior must be something specific, not just a general principle. The acting opposite plan becomes a new way of doing life that will support a healthier, more stable emotionality.